So this is, I guess, another part in my whole series of videos that is defending racism as a concept. I know, ooh, spooky, evil, sinister. I'm wrong on the face of it, right? My previous video was mostly about explaining the lie that's inherent in the accusations of racism is the unspoken condition that implies that if somebody calls you racist or phobic of something, that they're calling you irrational, because the dishonesty in that accusation is saying that your bigotry or your hatred of somebody or something or some group is not conditional and doesn't have a reason for it. So if, say, you're habitually preyed upon or abused by a group, you have every reason to hate them. And that goes both ways, towards white people and, of course, towards any given other group. And also that if you are, it implies that you're, say, not capable of liking an exception to the reason why you don't like a group. Like, say, you don't like black people because of violent crime, gang violence, any cultural thing, the attitude of anti-intellectualism and hedonism and all that shit. Maybe you don't like their music, their culture, their way of dressing, their way of talking. They've ruined your neighborhood, etc. Those are reasons. Those are logical reasons. But say if you take random Cripper blood on the street versus Neil deGrasse Tyson or Barack Obama or something. Well, Barack Obama's a bad example because he's just a gangbanger in a suit. But if you can't go from, like, say, a doctor or a scientist or a social worker or a lawyer or something and say that is different than the stereotype, and therefore they are an exception to that and I don't hate them, then you also aren't irrational. If you can't make exceptions or individualistic exceptions to your baseline of bigotry, then maybe you can be considered irrational and phobic. But if that is not the case, and I would argue that's not the case even for Ku Klux Klan members, then how exactly are you irrational? And how do you have an unreasonable bigotry? So this video, sorry to belabor the point with explaining the last one, but this video is more in line with cultural bigotry and distrust of other countries. Now, what made me think about making this video was a woman who was a defector from North Korea was recently on Joe Rogan's podcast, and she was just talking about how that place is hell on earth. It's not just, oh, those people are repressed and they have no rights. It's not just that the place is full of secret police and, but starvation, inability to travel anywhere, complete lack of any kind of safety, not just from other people, from predation, but from the elements. People talking about people freezing to death, talking about just random bodies everywhere, bodies on the streets, bodies outside of hospitals, bodies at train stations, bodies floating through the rivers. North Korea is probably worse than some of the worst war-torn, completely tribalistic monster hellholes in Africa. North Korea is probably the worst place to be on the entire fucking earth. Now, am I like xenophobic or some bullshit or whatever the word is for Koreans instead of Chinese people? If I say that fuck North Korea and fuck North Koreans, am I talking about all of them? Am I talking about being unable to appreciate a North Korean defector coming to want to, come live my way of life instead, my superior way of life, my white Western way of life? Do I automatically hate that person? Well, I'll tell you what, you might have an inability for a person like that to safely integrate. It seems to be less likely for a person like that to be able to safely immigrate than, say, some person from certain other shitholes in the world, certain parts of Mexico, certain parts of Africa, certain parts of the Middle East. These people can assimilate. You would have some expectation of a North Korean, because even everybody basically knows that Asians don't carry the same kind of barbaric stereotypes. But when you listen to a person sit there and talk to Joe Rogan about the normalcy and banality of seeing dozens of dead, rotting bodies every day, when you hear somebody talk about the normalcy of watching rats eat the eyeballs out of children and watching children catch those same rats off of dead bodies to eat for food, if you hear somebody talk about the normalcy of such a hellish world, that should give you pause, and that should give you some reason to judge that entire fucking culture. We can offer some caveats about that these people have a complete inability to resist, but a lot of these hellscape socialist, communist places happen because social communists rebelled against a state that supposedly shouldn't have been so easy to overthrow. But overthrows of state happen all the time, and a public has a responsibility to try to throw off that kind of thing. And honestly, America has the responsibility of not throwing money at a state like that to the tunes of tens of millions per year, if not billions. We throw money at these kinds of shitholes, whether it's the shithole of Puerto Rico, which is not exactly barbaric, but it's a shithole because a socialist public continues to enable a socialist leadership that oppresses and treats that entire territory like garbage. And everybody just lets it keep happening. Worse states, say in Colombia, worse states of a similar thing, Venezuela. But complicity, people being complicit in that kind of behavior is a result of the same culture America has now. America has currently, due to cooperation between banks, cooperation between corporations, cooperation between media organizations and the government, all acting in force to create the same culture that creates these shitholes, where we enable evil and applaud evil and harm people for telling the truth and harm people for being good and honest and upstanding. The way that those cultures got that way is by the public not resisting in any way those people. And I think that Americans really have a responsibility to resist the current culture trend and resist the current government explicitly and directly, because the only difference between America and a place like North Korea right now is just a matter of wealth that can be lost at any time and is rapidly being lost under the Biden administration. But also, the difference between us and them is we don't have cops running around arresting people for nothing and killing people for nothing yet. But as I've also stated in a lot of videos talking about the current crisis of legality and crisis of legislation in this country, the law doesn't exist. The law doesn't apply to people. There are people walking every day right now for murder charges and arson charges and assault with deadly weapon charges, violent felony charges. We live in an America where people used to go to jail for 10 to 20 for doing a lot of the shit. And now we're hearing news headlines like, oh, murderer walks free because the district attorney straight up didn't show up to the trial, physically did not show up to the trial to prosecute the man. Twice, as in, set a date to try the man for murder. Prosecutor does not arrive to courtroom. Court case is rescheduled. Prosecutor, again, does not arrive to courtroom. If you can't tell me that's not deliberate malice and an attack on the fucking constitutional law of this country by that prosecutor, you're fucking ridiculous. So, what I'm advocating for is for the law of this country as it exists to be enforced, and that in that state, America is a factually, objectively, measurably superior country with an objectively, factually superior culture to pretty much the rest of the world. However, we are being dragged down to these people's levels while being told that not only do we have a responsibility not to hold these other cultures' flaws against these cultures and against these peoples responsible for these cultures, we're being asked to treat ourselves as worse than them and to treat reducing ourselves to their level or beneath their level as some sort of act of penance or reparation for our crimes. Well, let me finish with this, because I don't intend this for this particular video to be much longer than it is already, although, of course, I ramble for 30 minutes all the time. Colonialism is like the big new swear word right now. The term for white man's crimes is colonialism, when oddly enough, colonialism used to be called white man's burden. That the racists and bigots of the past used to say that white Western countries slow their progress to a crawl or often to a standstill because we spend our wealth, our resources, and our time trying to drag savages out of the mud up to our level instead of leaving them to their own devices and taking care of ourselves. This is still going on right now, this moment, where even liberals, fucking Biswo, are out looking at Biden's COVID relief bill. $1.9 trillion, with less than $1 trillion of which earmarked for anything domestic. As in, most of that money is being pissed away in some other country, in the Middle East, in Pakistan, in Israel, in Saudi Arabia, in Africa, the United Arab Emirates, aid to other places, fucking sending it off to South America or to China. It's earmarked for this or that. And no American will directly benefit from any of it. While this country's economy continues a fucking goddamn terminal nosedive into beyond 2008 recession levels, we're pissing our still tremendous wealth away on stuff that doesn't help anybody. And then the government has the nerve to call you a monster and a domestic terrorist and a white supremacist for being upset about it. That your shit is being taken away from you and given to strangers. Now, I have to reiterate every time I talk about the virtuous selfishness of the American taxpayer. The government does not have money. The government does not make money. The government does not own anything. The government, supposedly, with your consent, appropriates and redistributes your money, supposedly in the interest of the greater good. Now, despite Democrats, and indeed sometimes Republicans, trying to claim to be the party of the greater good, neither of them seem particularly interested in your well-being, in your goodness. Both of them seem to want to piss money straight up the mountain, if they even piss money on American soil. Normally, they're chucking it at some other rich fucker in some other country. Countries that I don't think we have any right to appreciate or any responsibility to worry about, especially China, which is about as rich as we are as we speak, still benefiting off of us, because the difference between America and China is China has slavery, China has enforced poverty and robber baron culture, China has a slim middle class, an incredibly wealthy new rich, and still an army of fucking peasants living in the dirt that are being preyed upon by their feudal serf masters, basically, their lords. And in America, we're arguing over how much to pay people minimum wage when 95% of the world would kill for $7.75 an hour when so much of the world lives on $1 a day, or if they're lucky, $2 to $5 a day. A fucking day. That's what they live off of. And that's equivalent wealth. Meaning that if you had $5 a day, how well would you fucking operate, sir? Or madam? You wouldn't. Which is why their countries are shitholes. Now, back to my point, my final point. What colonialism has done has introduced Western economies, Western medicine, Western government, the Western concepts of actually freedoms of the individuals, that we are not all slaves of a king. We're not all serfs to a lord. That we're supposedly people with rights. That we've brought democracy to these people. We've brought farming and food, and we give them all this, and a lot of the time, depending on the culture, they cannot actually take that ball and run with it. You can give certain African peoples a farm, show them here's how you irrigate said farm, here's the seeds you plant, here's how you rotate crops. If you do this, you will not starve. And then the white colonialist fucks off and they come back and everybody's starving. The farm is in disrepair. They ran the shit into ground in 10 years or 5 years or less. At what point do you go, is it the white man's responsibility? Indeed, is it his burden to continue trying to force these people to adopt something that they apparently are incapable of adopting? You know, and again, one of the great fears of liberal intellectuals is anybody addressing the scientific fact that a significant portion, not all of them, it's not so much true of Eastern Africans or some Northern Africans especially, but seems to be the case for a lot of Central Africa, that if you IQ tested these people on average, they're literally at or below the threshold of what we consider mental retardation. People who are invalids, who can't function, people that we throw disability money at because we don't expect them to be able to survive without help. There are entire nations of these people. Don't think about that. Don't even talk about that. Don't hold that against them. Don't stop throwing money at them. Don't leave them to their own devices. I mean, China is currently trying to do the whole colonialist game in Africa that Europe was trying to do a couple hundred years ago. You know, part of why Europe pulled out of Africa, and the Dutch and the English and the Spanish and all them and the French stopped trying to colonialize most of Africa? It was not financially viable. You couldn't make money off these people despite the wealth of resources that they sat on. In fact, probably the only way that you could make a financially viable colony that your host country benefits from, or excuse me, the country colonializing them can benefit from, you'd probably have to genocide these places and resettle them with somebody else. Now that's an ugly idea. That you can't even successfully rape and pillage a country without getting rid of the people who live there. Because if you just tried to colonialize them, which I argue is not necessarily a bad thing, and it often was not a bad thing, not in the long run. Of course, there was tyranny and oppression and robbery and murder and rape and all that shit, and that was wrong. And, you know, it took Britain a long time to stop acting that way. Even when they were trying to do a more dignified takeover of India, they were still bastards. I know that's part of the history. I'm not denying it. However, in the long run, when you are giving these people all the benefits of living in a superior Western culture and they cannot continue the relay race, they can't take the baton they've been given and carry it to their own benefit. In fact, you can't actually even enslave these people and hope to make something out of their land. It's literally not worth the manpower and money to do it. In what way is it wrong? In what way is it illogical to say, well, that's an inferior culture with an inferior people. And oftentimes these are the kind of people who find it difficult to assimilate into Western society without trying to rape and steal. These are people who sometimes don't even really get the concept that stealing is wrong. Keep in mind, when you reach a certain IQ threshold, you don't actually have a theory of mind. And without a theory of mind, you don't have human empathy. And in fact, the lower that number goes, the chance that you even understand right from wrong, if you even understand good from evil, gets blurred to the point of it's not being there, that you are an animalistic sociopath at that point. And indeed, you could even take a smart country full of people with a median IQ that is higher than white people and still get North Korea, and still get China, and still get imperial feudalistic Japan. You still get these inferior cultures. And oftentimes, these cultures didn't grow alongside white Western cultures. White Western cultures conquered them and dragged them kicking and screaming into modern civilization. Happened to Japan, happened to parts of China, happened to India, happened to as much of Africa as it could happen to. So in what way is Jingoism and cultural bigotry exactly wrong when there is a functional, measurable difference between these cultures that doesn't just border on we wear different clothes and speak different things and worship different gods, but no, indeed, we have a different idea of what murder is, or rape, or theft, or slavery, or predation, or terrorism, or what is even dignified warfare. I've seen things that Africa do to each other. Have you ever seen somebody beat somebody to death slowly with a blunt machete? Have you ever seen anybody with a tire full of pitch put around their head and set on fire and burn slowly to death? Have you ever seen a group of people decapitate somebody and play soccer with their severed head? Have you ever heard any of the stories of what North Korea was like, really like, and still is like to this fucking day, as told by people who lived there and were raised there, and still can't even fully grasp the fact that they lived in a society where seeing scores of dead, rotting, frozen bodies all over the place every day was normal, that they didn't feel anything about it. Because it's not just an IQ thing or a genetics thing. People have to be conditioned to be civilized a lot of the time. The absence of law enforcement will produce an increase in crime no matter what the state of your cultural norms are. And you can take people who are supposedly bright and drag them down to an animalistic level relatively easily without vigilance, without resistance. Indeed, something that is to be said about the negatives, the decadence, the spoiling of the white Western culture, especially in America, in 2-3 generations now, there is not men who know what it's like to fight and die for survival and protection of their country and of their people. Now, patriotism is a dirty word. Now, pride is a dirty word only for white people, only for straight people. Socialists can be prideful, and dragonkin, and fucking bronies, and fetishists, and degenerates can have pride all they want. Now your sexual fetishes are your identity, and it must be protected, not just culturally, but enforced by the state. We can't ever dislike you. We can't hold it against you. Who here can tell me there isn't something incredibly sinister and dangerous about this? And it's not just, ooh, dangerous, another one of the buzzwords that leftists have ruined. It's dangerous because people will die as a result of this kind of thing, of the normalization of mental illness and sexual fetishization, and of cultural bullying. And I say that the person who has the right to drag the ship around, the person who has the right to make everybody fall in line and use force to enforce a certain cultural standard, a certain level of tolerance and or intolerance, are the people who have objectively produced the superior society that actually protects the people within it, even the degenerates and undesirables, the invalids and the sociopaths. There is a superior culture, and if that superior culture is not enforced by force, this is another reason why libertarianism is bullshit. If left to their own devices, there are people who will become serial killers and rapists and thieves and criminals. And the only way to produce the superior society is to punish those people, to prevent them by force from dragging us down to their level. And if that's fascism, well, fascism is better than what you're offering. Not just for me, but for you.